All right, the learner, you know what time it is. It is time for a brand new deep dive. And this one goes out specifically to you because you were the one who shared this absolutely fascinating text by C.G. Jung, A Teoria da Psychoanalysis. And I got to say, I'm super stoked to dig into this with you today because we're going way back to the early days of psychoanalysis, those foundational ideas that Sigmund Freud was developing.
Right.
And we're going to see them through the lens of Carl Jung, who had some pretty interesting takes on what Freud was putting out there.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So our mission today is to kind of like extract the core concepts from this book, see where the debates and disagreements were and what it all means for us. Just trying to understand how our minds work.
Yeah.
We're going to be talking about how the thinking around trauma evolved.
Right.
This wild concept of repression. The whole thing about sexuality in childhood, which is always a bit of a touchy subject.
Yeah.
What libido actually is, and then how our unconscious fantasies, those things we don't even realize we're thinking about, how those connect with our real life problems and maybe even contribute to neuroses.
Right. Yeah.
So, okay, so where do we even begin with all of this?
Well, Jung starts us off with this thing called the traumatic theory.
Okay.
And, if we go back even further, we got to think about Charcot, who observed this really interesting thing that he could actually induce hysterical symptoms through hypnotism.
Wow.
But then he could also remove them using the same method.
So he was like manipulating these symptoms.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just with hypnotism.
Exactly. So his idea was that hysteria that was caused by accidents, right, operated in a similar way, that the shock of the accident would temporarily paralyze the person's willpower. And in that moment, the memory of that trauma would get sort of fixated in their mind.
Oh, wow.
Almost like a self-suggestion.
Like imprinted.
Yeah.
Almost like a stamp on their psyche.
Exactly. And Jung actually points to this as the very first understanding or theory within psychoanalysis.
So it's like a direct connection.
Yeah.
A shock.
Yeah.
A traumatic event.
Yeah.
Leads to a psychological problem because of this imprinting.
Right, right. It's like a one-to-one kind of thing.
But then Breuer and Freud came along and they kind of expanded on this.
Yeah, they really broadened it.
Yeah.
And Jung emphasizes this as a crucial contribution of theirs,
Right.
showing that even in cases of hysteria where there wasn't this clear, big traumatic event, an accident or something like that, there was still this element of trauma that seemed to be at play.
So it wasn't just about those big events anymore.
Yeah, it expanded beyond that.
It was more subtle emotional things potentially.
Exactly, exactly. And Freud, being a student of Charcot, he was naturally looking to kind of confirm these initial ideas.
Right, yeah, because he had that background with Charcot.
And Jung points out that Freud's theory that he elaborated from his experience at that time was really marked by this focus on a traumatic origin.
Okay.
But here's where things get really interesting, because Freud didn't just stop at that self-suggestion idea. He actually went much deeper into the psychological and even psychophysical effects of shock. What happens to the mind and the body when you experience this kind of trauma.
Right, so he wasn't just thinking about like the memory of it.
Yeah.
He was thinking about the impact on the whole system.
Exactly, the whole system. And this is what led him to that concept of Affektentklemmung.
Affektentklemmung.
Yeah, it's a mouthful, isn't it?
Yeah.
But it basically means blocked affect or a blockage of emotion.
Okay, so the emotion gets kind of trapped.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. So Freud's idea was that this shock, right, creates this kind of excitation in the system, this energy. And normally that energy would find a natural outlet. He called it a repression.
A repression.
Yeah, it's like a working through it, a way of processing and releasing that energy. But in hysteria, this release is incomplete. It's like it gets stuck.
Okay.
And that leads to this buildup of excitation, this Affektentklemmung.
This blocked energy.
Exactly. And think of it like pent-up energy, you know? That's just waiting to find a way out. And Freud's idea was that this energy then gets converted into physical symptoms through this mechanism he called conversion.
Oh, wow.
So the key takeaway here is that he went beyond just the memory of the trauma.
Yeah.
And he started thinking about this trapped emotional energy.
That's a big leap.
Yeah.
From just the memory to energy.
It is a huge leap.
That's getting stuck and coming out in different ways.
Yeah. And it's important to remember that this was all very new and groundbreaking at the time.
Yeah.
These were the early days of psychoanalysis, and they were really trying to understand these complex phenomena.
But Jung being Jung, he wasn't completely sold on this trauma as the sole explanation.
Yeah, Jung was always a bit skeptical, wasn't he?
Yeah.
He was skeptical that something as complex as a full-blown neurosis
Yeah.
could really be based solely on long past emotional experiences.
So even though that energy component is there,
Yeah.
he's like, there's got to be more to it than just that.
Right. And you know, it's interesting because at the time there was this big trend of attributing all sorts of abnormal psychic conditions to hereditary degeneration, like it was all in your genes.
Like you were born with it.
Exactly. And Jung pushed back against that. He didn't like these overly simplistic views, and he actually used a really helpful comparison. He compared it to tuberculosis.
Oh, okay.
So just like with TB, where you have both a predisposition, right? Some people are more vulnerable to it, but then you also have these environmental factors, like actually getting infected with the bacteria.
Right.
Jung suggests that neuroses are kind of similar.
So it's nature and nurture playing together.
It's never just one thing or the other.
Right,
it's this complex interplay of factors. And he says that neither a theory that focuses too much on predisposition, like that shock theory, nor one that solely blames the environment could really give us the whole picture.
It's got to be a combination.
It has to be.
Yeah. Okay, so now we got to talk about repression.
Yes.
This cornerstone of Freudian thought.
Yeah.
Verdrängung, I believe, is the original German term.
That's right.
So what's that all about?
Well, in simple terms, Jung explains that repression, according to Freud, is basically this psychological mechanism where the mind takes a conscious thought, something you're aware of, and pushes it back down into the unconscious, that part of our minds that we're not directly aware of.
Okay, so it's like hiding something from ourselves.
Exactly. It's like tucking it away in a drawer that you don't look in very often.
There we go.
And this idea came from observing patients who seem to have completely forgotten very significant events or thoughts, you know?
Really important stuff.
Yeah, really important stuff. It was as if these things had just vanished from their memory.
I mean, it's almost hard to believe that we could just blank on something so significant.
Yeah, it is. And Jung acknowledges that this was a surprising finding for them as well.
Okay.
But Breuers and Freud, they found that they needed these special techniques to bring these seemingly lost traumatic events back into the patient's conscious awareness.
So they had to kind of go digging to bring this stuff back up.
And of course, you know, this was met with some skepticism back then.
Oh, I'm sure.
You know, people were questioning whether these recall memories were genuine or if they were maybe just suggestions planted during hypnosis.
Right, like the power of suggestion is strong.
It is. And Jung acknowledges the possibility, but he points out that there were many cases where these repressed memories were actually verified by objective evidence. You know, things that could be confirmed.
Oh, so it wasn't just the patient saying, oh, yeah, I remember this now.
Right.
There was like external corroboration.
Exactly. There was stuff to back it up and beyond that he actually points to association tests as another form of experimental proof for repression.
Okay, association tests now. What are those?
Well, it's basically this experimental method where you give people words and ask them to respond with the first word that comes to mind.
Okay, seems simple enough.
It does, right? But what they found was that when they gave people emotionally charged words, words that might be connected to some kind of personal issue, people would often hesitate or give unusual responses.
Oh, interesting.
And they were more likely to forget the original word later on.
Like their mind was trying to avoid it.
Exactly. It suggested that the underlying emotional issue, whatever that complex was interfering with their conscious thought process.
Right.
And Jung even references his own research, which was later confirmed, showing that painful events are most rarely reproduced correctly.
Oh, wow. That's pretty powerful.
Yeah. So his point is that repression isn't just some theoretical idea. There's actual evidence that our minds do push unwanted thoughts and memories out of our awareness.
It's like a defense mechanism.
It is.
Protecting us from stuff.
But then Jung raises this really interesting question. You know, is this repression something we do consciously? Like we decide we don't want to think about something and push it away?
Like a deliberate choice.
Yeah. Or does it happen automatically?
Right.
You know, without us even realizing it. And he talks about how Freud actually found evidence for both.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he gives examples of patients who could actually pinpoint the moment when they decided not to think about a particular memory.
Wow.
So there was a conscious element there, but then there were also cases where it seemed to happen more unconsciously.
Like it just slipped out of their awareness.
Exactly. And Jung argues that this distinction is really important.
Okay.
Because it ties back into that whole nature versus nurture debate.
Right.
You know, are we shaped more by our experiences or are we kind of pre-programmed in a certain way? And he says that cases where the environment and upbringing seem to be the main factor, those might respond differently to treatment than cases where someone's inherent predisposition seems to be stronger.
So it has practical implications for therapy.
Exactly.
True stuff.
And then Jung points out something really crucial here.
Okay.
He says that this idea of repression actually kind of contradicts that original shock theory.
How so?
Well, the shock theory says that it's the external event.
A trauma.
Right, the trauma that causes the problem.
Yeah.
But repression suggests that there's this internal factor at play as well.
This choice or this automatic process?
Exactly. It's not just a passive reaction to an event.
Right. There's something more going on inside.
Yeah, and he brings up Freud's case of Miss Lucy R. as an example.
Okay.
Where the main issue wasn't the traumatic events themselves, but the patient's own unwillingness to acknowledge certain feelings she had.
So her own internal struggle was a big part of it.
Yeah, it was central to the whole thing.
Okay, so that's really interesting because it so shifts the focus away from these single dramatic events to something deeper and more internal. And Jung then goes on to discuss how Freud's thinking evolved and eventually shifted towards the importance of early childhood. And that's when we get to this really controversial idea of infantile sexual trauma. So tell me about that. How did that whole theory come about?
Well, Jung traces how the theory of neurosis kind of developed over time. You know, it started with that trauma concept that we were talking about. But then Freud started realizing that traumatic events later in life, they only really had an impact when you took into account the person's underlying predisposition.
Like their vulnerability to those events.
Exactly. Like some people might be more susceptible to certain types of trauma because of their own personal history.
Okay.
So that got him thinking about the roots of these hysterical symptoms in childhood. Like what happened in those early years that might have made someone more vulnerable later on.
Right.
And this eventually led to patients recalling scenes that involved sexual activity, either things that happened to them or things that they did.
Okay.
And these memories were very strongly linked to the onset of their neurosis.
Like that's when things started to go wrong.
Exactly. And that's the core of that theory of infantile sexual trauma.
Okay, so that's a pretty huge idea.
It is.
To suggest that these very early experiences could have such a lasting impact.
It was a radical idea at the time.
Yeah.
And it was met with intense opposition.
Oh, I can imagine.
And Jung points out that it wasn't just a disagreement with the shock theory in general. It was specifically this element of sexuality that people were really reacting to.
Right, the idea of children having sexual feelings.
Yeah, it was just not something people wanted to talk about or even think about.
Especially back then.
Especially back then.
It was so taboo.
Exactly. It was a huge societal barrier.
Yeah.
You know, the idea that children could have these sexual thoughts and feelings, and that those thoughts and feelings could somehow play a role in their adult problems, that was deeply disturbing to many people.
I can understand that.
And on top of that, the possibility that hysteria, which, you know, at the time was seen as this very feminine problem, the possibility that that could have a sexual basis was also very unwelcome, especially because the older ideas about hysteria, they were just being discarded.
Yeah.
And those older ideas were more respectable, you could say.
Like a medical problem.
Yeah, more like a physical issue, not something related to sexuality.
Yeah.
So as a result, Freud's observations were heavily questioned, and often the criticisms were accompanied by a lot of moral outrage.
Like, how dare he suggest this about children?
Exactly.
So it was very charged.
It was very emotionally charged, and that made it really difficult to have any kind of objective scientific discussion about it.
Right. So it wasn't just about the science anymore.
Yeah. No, it became very much entangled with the social and moral beliefs of the time.
Right. So how did the theory evolve from there?
Well, Jung talks about how the shock theory was then modified to include this idea that the shock itself, the traumatic event, it wasn't always a real thing that happened.
Okay.
It could also be a fantasy.
Oh, wow. So it's not even an actual event.
Right. It could be something that played out in the child's imagination.
Okay. So how did that further complicate things?
Well, Jung argues that this actually made things even more complex.
Okay.
Because it suggested that a sexual element in childhood wasn't always due to some external event, but it could originate in the child's own mind.
So from their internal world.
Exactly, in their fantasies. And he even makes this really interesting and I would say somewhat controversial point.
Right.
That real sexual traumatic events, the ones that actually happened, might not always occur without the child somehow being involved.
Involved? Like how?
Well, he suggests that maybe in some cases, the child might unconsciously seek out these experiences or even provoke them in some way.
That's a really heavy idea.
It is. It's a very difficult idea to grapple with. And, you know, it's important to note that Jung's is not saying that all children who experience sexual trauma are somehow responsible.
Right.
He's simply suggesting that there might be some cases where the child's own unconscious dynamics are at play.
Okay.
And this is where things get really murky. You know, it's hard to tease apart what's coming from the outside world
versus what's coming from inside.
Exactly. And Jung points out that while Freud's investigations did confirm the psychological consequences of these early experiences, his original idea that you would always find an actual traumatic scene, that wasn't always the case.
So sometimes it was real. Sometimes it was fantasy.
Right. And sometimes it was a mix of both.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it so complicated.
Right. So we have to think about not just the real scary things that happen to us,
but also the world of our imagination.
Especially in childhood. Because that's where these early fantasies can really take root.
Okay.
And Jung uses this example of a patient who had amnesia that was triggered by a very minor shock later in life.
Okay.
And he uses that to highlight this disproportionate role of fantasy.
Like a small thing sets off this big reaction.
And it makes you wonder, why would a childhood trauma...
Real or imagined.
Right.
Lie dormant for so long.
Yeah.
And then be set off by something seemingly insignificant.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is.
And Jung questions this as well.
Okay.
He asks, why would the effect of this childhood trauma remain hidden for so long, especially when this particular patient had faced much more serious dangers in their life without developing a neurosis?
Right.
So there had to be something else going on.
Yeah, there's more to it.
There's something about that particular trauma that made it stick.
Okay.
And this brings us back to that crucial question of predisposition.
Yeah.
Why is it that some people seem so much more vulnerable to certain experiences?
Yeah, why does the same event affect people so differently?
Exactly. And Jung emphasizes that this is a really central question for understanding why seemingly irrelevant past events can continue to disrupt our normal reactions in real life.
It's like we're carrying this baggage from the past.
We are, and sometimes we don't even realize it.
And this sexual element keeps popping up.
Yeah, it does.
And Jung, he points to Freud's discovery that there's this sexual component, often unconscious, that's connected to the shock.
Right.
And he says that's often what gives the traumatic effect its power.
It's like this hidden charge that's lurking beneath the surface.
And that unconscious nature of childhood sexuality helps to explain why that original traumatic event has such a lasting impact.
Exactly, because the true emotional meaning of it remains hidden from the person's conscious awareness. So they can't process it. They can't work through it.
It's just there festering.
It's like a wound that never fully heals.
Right.
And this persistent unconscious issue, it acts like a kind of delayed suggestion.
Okay.
Waiting for the right moment to trigger the reaction.
Oh, wow. So this whole discussion about childhood sexuality.
Yeah.
This obviously brings up the question of how do we define and understand sexuality in childhood?
Especially back then.
Especially back then.
Yeah, it was a very different time.
So how does Jung address these objections? People saying children only develop true sexuality at puberty.
Right.
How does he approach that?
Well, Jung argues for a much broader view of sexuality, a more biological view.
Okay.
He says it's not just about the physical act itself.
Right.
It's about all these related phenomena like pregnancy, childbirth, natural selection, the protection and care of offspring, the whole continuation of the species.
Wow. So he's looking at it from this like evolutionary perspective, this bigger picture.
And he believes that many psychological functions are also linked to this wider sphere of sexuality, including fantasy.
Right.
He says that fantasy plays a really important role in preparing for the sexual function later in life.
So it's not just about the physical act.
No.
It's about the psychological and emotional.
Yeah, that's preparation.
And he suggests that we think of sexuality as this instinct for preserving the species.
Okay.
Contrasting it with our instinct for self-preservation.
So it's not just about me surviving.
Yeah.
It's about the species surviving.
Exactly. And from that perspective, it makes sense that the roots of this instinct go much deeper than a narrow definition of sexuality would allow.
Right, because it's about something bigger than just the individual.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he even draws this really interesting parallel with young animals.
Okay.
You know how they have these playful behaviors that mimic adult instincts?
Right, like puppies, play fighting. Exactly. And he suggests that humans are probably no different.
Even though we might not see it as clearly.
Right. And maybe it's not as obvious in well-behaved children.
Right.
But he believes that these early manifestations of the instinct for species preservation are probably present in some form.
So it's there even if we don't see it.
Yeah, it's lurking beneath the surface.
Okay. But then Jung pushes back on one of Freud's specific ideas.
He does.
And that's the idea of an infant taking the mother's breast as a form of sexuality.
Yeah, he uses that phrase, sexualidad du laiton, which is pretty provocative.
Yeah, the sexuality of the piglet.
It is, but he does acknowledge Freud's cleverness in suggesting that the instinct for species preservation, it develops separately from the instinct for self-preservation right from the beginning.
Like from the moment we're born.
Exactly.
But he doesn't agree with that.
He doesn't. He finds it biologically problematic because he argues that for a considerable period of time, an individual's life processes are solely about nutrition and growth.
Just like getting bigger and stronger.
Exactly.
Okay.
And he compares that to the asexual larval stage of insects.
So there's no sexual function yet?
Not at that stage.
Okay.
And he believes that the time in the womb and then the breastfeeding period in humans, those are marked by this absence of sexual function.
So it doesn't make sense to talk about sexuality then?
Not in that narrow sense.
Okay.
So he sees the idea of clear sexuality during nursing as a bit of a contradiction.
Right. It's like we're imposing our adult understanding onto these babies who have very different needs.
Exactly. And he goes on to talk about the difficulty of separating the nutritive and sexual aspects of sucking. You know?
Okay.
It's not easy to tease those apart.
Right, because a baby does get pleasure from sucking.
They do.
But that doesn't necessarily mean it's sexual.
Right. And he cautions against just automatically equating pleasure with sexuality.
Especially in infants. Okay, so this brings us to the concept of libido. And I know this is a big one.
It is.
For psychoanalysis. And I know Freud had a very specific understanding of it.
He did.
But how does Jung define libido?
Well, he starts by explaining that the earlier idea of having all these separate instincts, you know.
Different instincts for different things.
Yeah, side by side.
Right.
That was gradually being replaced by a more energetic view.
Okay, so instead of these separate things, it's like one energy that can be expressed in different ways.
Exactly, and they chose the term libido to represent this energy.
Okay, and I know Freud focused very much on the sexual aspect of libido.
He did.
But Jung seems to be taking a broader view.
Yeah, he definitely does. And he emphasizes this analogy to the law of conservation of energy.
Oh, okay. That's from physics.
Yeah, you know.
Energy cannot be created or destroyed.
Exactly. It can only be transformed from one form to another.
Yeah.
So when energy seems to disappear in one place, it has to go somewhere else.
Right.
It has to reappear in another form.
And he's applying that to the psyche.
He is.
To our minds.
Yes. And he suggests that when you see a lot of libido concentrated in one area.
Like someone's really fixated on something?
Yeah, like an obsessive thought or a strong belief. That might mean there's a deficiency of libido somewhere else.
Like their energy is all tied up in that one thing.
Exactly.
And there's not enough left for other things.
It's like a limited pool of energy.
Okay.
And psychoanalysis becomes the method for identifying where there's too much or too little libido.
Right.
And then trying to restore balance.
So it's like redistributing the energy.
Exactly.
Okay, so how does this view of libido help us understand neurosis?
Well, Jung sees symptoms of neurosis as exaggerated and disturbed manifestations of functioning.
Okay.
And they're overflowing with this libido that's been withdrawn from other areas.
It's like the energy's going to the wrong place.
Yeah, it's like getting stuck and creating these symptoms.
And what about conditions where there's a lack of energy?
Yeah, like apathy.
Yeah.
That's where we have to ask, where did the libido go?
Right.
Because it's still there.
It has to be somewhere.
It has to be somewhere.
But it's inaccessible.
Yeah, it's hidden away in the unconscious.
Okay, so then he introduces this idea of fantasy systems of the unconscious.
Yeah, these are those patterns of thought and feeling that are happening outside of our conscious awareness.
And they're like fantasies.
They are like our conscious fantasies, but they're happening in the unconscious.
Okay, so we don't even know we're having these fantasies.
Exactly. And Jung says that in cases of neurotic apathy,
where there's that lack of energy, that's where the libido is going.
Right, it's getting directed towards these unconscious fantasy systems.
And he acknowledges that this is kind of a figurative way of speaking.
It is.
But he argues that we have to accept that there are these psychological entities that exist outside of our consciousness.
Okay.
And he points to the way that complex delusional symptoms can suddenly emerge in some patients.
As evidence that there's this unconscious psychological development and preparation happening.
So it's like things are brewing under the surface.
Exactly, and then they burst forth into consciousness.
Okay, so these unconscious fantasy systems, they can have a big impact on us.
They can't.
Even if we don't realize it.
Even if we're completely unaware of them.
Okay, now let's get back to this idea of using sexual language to talk about libido.
Okay.
Mostly when we're talking about children.
Mm-hmm.
Jung mentioned that Freud observed tendencies in early childhood.
Right.
That he called perversions.
Yeah.
So how does this concept of libido as this more general psychic energy, how does that change that view?
Well, Jung acknowledges that Freud had his reasons for using sexual terminology to describe these early childhood tendencies. But he argues that with the introduction of libido as this more general psychic energy, these early components, they lose their primary importance in adults.
Okay.
They become more like potentialities.
Or like possibility.
Exactly like seeds that might or might not grow.
Right.
But the real power lies in the libido itself.
Okay.
The energy that animates those potentialities.
So it's not the specific tendencies themselves, it's the energy behind them.
Exactly. And he points out that Freud often defines libido in a very sexual way.
Okay.
You know, like sexual desire.
Right.
Which we typically think of as something that emerges at puberty.
Yeah.
So this creates a bit of a problem when you're trying to understand Freud's idea of the child having this polymorphous, perverse sexuality.
Okay, so that's that idea that children have all these different sexual possibilities that they're exploring.
Yeah, before puberty.
But if libido is only sexual
Right.
and only kicks in at puberty,
then how can it explain those earlier tendencies?
Exactly. It seems like a contradiction.
It does.
So Jung is trying to reconcile these ideas.
Yeah, he's trying to find a way to make sense of it all.
Guys, see you in another podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel.